On the turn of the millennium, the BBC gave the role of head of drama to a woman called Jane Tranter, a role where she became responsible for overseeing all drama output across the corporation. And in the early 2000s, she was involved in launching big TV shows such as Spooks, Waking the Dead, State of Play, Bleak House, and many others. At the time, her control of the television output in the corporation was unprecedented, as she would eventually be promoted to a brand new position as head of fiction, giving her control of all internally produced comedy, films, and the acquiring of overseas properties. It's a brief so broad that when she stepped down in 2009, her responsibilities were replaced by 4 separate individuals. This single embodiment of power within the corporation is potentially unique, but without it the BBC may never have had the nerve to take one of the greatest successful gambles of their long history. It feels strange to say it today, but in 2004, Doctor Who was almost a toxic property. There hadn't been a series since 1989, and barring a single TV movie that was co-produced for an American audience, some anniversary conventions, some online animations, and a few repeats to test the water, Doctor Who had not been on prime television for 15 years. That's not to say it did not have fans. There were flourishing book, audio drama and comic series that were arguably at the top of their game, producing high quality products for an increasingly demanding audience. With the absence of screen time, the series had split itself across several different types of media, most notably the book series that picked up the reins where it had been dropped in 1989 and had been producing 2 books a month for over a decade that both moved the series forward and filled in gaps in its history. These books often embodied the prevailing trends of 1990s science fiction. As the Doctor Who fandom matured in age, the books went with them and they explored increasingly dark and complex themes. The Virgin New Adventures and then the BBC 8th Doctor books are perhaps worthy of their own examination, but to summarise it, it is fair to say that, although they were modelled on the television show, they'd become something very different over the 15-year gap. The general populace was unaware of this transition, however. They recalled a kooky old television show where a man with a long scarf, or sometimes a funny hat, ran up and down corridors, usually made with wobbly sets, usually made out of cardboard apparently, waving a magic wand at robot dogs or giant Nazi pepper pots. Whilst the Doctor Who fandom had matured, the media of 2004 had redacted their collected memories and reimagined that Doctor Who had been some kind of juvenile joke perfectly suitable for public ridicule. Jane Tranter and the controller of the corporation's primary channel, Lorraine Heggessy, disagreed with this perception. In its time, Doctor Who had been at home on BBC One and attracted a beloved audience in the tens of millions. It had been designed to fill a specific slot in the channel's Saturday tea time schedule, an offering with specific elements designed to appeal to men, women, children, all at the same time. It would be fun and engaging. It would tell a dramatic story. It would explore and teach historical concepts and scientific ideas. It would have action, drama, a new setting every month, and a brand new cast every few years. It could potentially run forever. Until, in the late 1980s, following some very public spats and arguably neglected production team, the BBC had simply lost faith. So I have an admission to make at this point. I really struggle with TV shows. I really struggle with the concept of box set culture. An American television series that run for 50 episodes a year. Some of these shows are fantastic, but they're also repetitive, starring the same cast of people, standing in the same type of settings, discussing the same topics and slowly incrementing the same narrative for dozens of hours. I find it draining. The UK model is usually to have a run of 6 or 8 episodes a year, so that shows can be produced as high a quality as possible without ever letting the concept become stale. But Doctor Who was different. It had an idea that would be later emulated by shows such as Star Trek, Quantum Leap or Stargate. It would be different every week. It would take a core cast of characters and move them from place to place, time to time, story to story, and very rarely, almost never look back. Doctor Who was a television show that had been great. It was a show that had, at times, been awful. It was a show that was always challenging its audiences with new and inventive ideas. It was a show that guaranteed the audience something new, but still familiar, every week. And this was a concept that Jane Tranter and Lorraine Heggessey wanted back on the corporation, and so they approached Russel T Davies, a writer most notably known for his series Queer as Folk, but also fantasy drama Dark Season, Century Falls and religious critique The Second Coming, to take the reins. Russell was famous for being a fan of Doctor Who. He'd even written a novel a decade earlier for the New Adventure series, and separately petitioned for the show to come back to previous BBC executives. He was brought on board as both an executive producer of the show and the head writer. At the time, head writer was a little of an oddity in UK television. Besides a very few notable exceptions, most television shows were producer or director led, with writers being directed to fill in the plot points or redirect scripts as the showrunner demanded. However, Russell was clear that if Doctor Who was to return and succeed, it had to have excellent story-led scripts. Somewhat controversially, Russell also insisted that this was not going to be a reboot. This was the same man, the same TARDIS, the same universe that Doctor Who fandom had known for 40 years. Normally, at the time when old shows were resurrected by a new production team, it was a chance to reimagine the original with a modern production values and sensibilities. However, in one fell stroke, assuring them that their precious continuity was safe, Russel T Davies brought a loyal fan base on his side. That he then wrote stories that, for the most part, ignored that continuity, was his masterstroke. He stripped the baggage that had been building up around the character throughout the 1970s and 80s and took the show back to some core themes. Mysterious man in a time machine takes companion on adventures. Yes, a classic iconic monster was brought back in the first episode. For all intents and purposes, it may as well have been a brand new one. RTD set the show around a new character, Rose Tyler, who meets a new doctor and is swept up in the chance to see the universe and escape her humdrum existence. For the first year, we meet and experience the Doctor through Rose's eyes, and it isn't until episode 6 that the continuity with the old series actually raises its head in the form of the show's most iconic villains. Because, as I had said, the media had not forgotten Doctor Who completely. They still remembered the Nazi pepperpots that couldn't climb stairs, although they really always could. But we'll get to the Daleks soon. Right from the off, there was curiosity around the show. As soon as Russel T Davies was put forward as the new showrunner, he was bombarded with questions about what he was keeping and changing. Will the sets wobble? He was asked by a pundit who snarkily suggested that the cheap production values of the 1970s were the show's main selling point. Russell gamely assured the critics that they would not, and he would personally lean against the sets to prop them up if it required. Media pressure was relentless from the off, although it wasn't until the final weeks before the launch that the pressure would mount. At press screenings, the critics were amazed at how vibrant and fresh the show suddenly felt, although there was a backlash against Russel T Davies' apparent queer agenda. He was asked if he was making the show deliberately camp or had an agenda to gay up the TARDIS. The new showrunner faced these criticisms head on and was observed arguing with critics that, "Of course I have an agenda, deal with it." Then in March 2005, an early cut of the first episode was leaked onto the internet. Looking back now, this moment, the precipice of the show's relaunch, was an extremely odd time. The production team, Russell, Mal Young, Phil Collinson and Judy Gardner, all had faith in their product, but they did not know how hot the audience reaction would be. Columnists in British newspapers were all sniping at the BBC, keen to see it crash and burn, and the fan base was full of trepidation over how good or bad would it potentially be. I mean, if this failed, then that really would be the end. However, other corners of the British press seemed much more open to the idea. They were won over by Billie Piper's performance as Rose Tyler. They were beguiled by the acting strengths of Christopher Eccleston, and Russell's decision to jettison all of that unnecessary continuity, while still silently and without ever drawing attention to it, respecting most of it, it all paid dividends. This was a new show that anyone could pick up with no knowledge of what had come before. And by centering the show around the companion much more firmly than the series had ever done since the 1960s, it gave the audience a representative through all of the weirdness that followed. Russel T Davies' gift for writing believable characters holds just as much for space aliens in the 31st century as it does advertising executives from the 1990s. Wherever the show went, Russel ensured that the characters it introduced were lively, exciting, interesting people, all with wants, needs and desires that were instantly recognisable. The biggest continuity change that Russel brought about was an addition to the Doctor's character. As early as the second episode, it's revealed that he was a fugitive from a war, the Time War, that had wiped out all of his people. This sent the loyal fans of the old show into hysterics as they knew exactly what this meant to their beloved continuity. It really is an offshoot, but it's worth mentioning that in the ongoing book series, the Doctor's home planet of Gallifrey had controversially been blown up 4 years before. With the news that the television show was coming back, and that this would not be a reboot, the books had taken great pains to bring Gallifrey back and restore the status quo to be exactly what they had been before. Why is this relevant? Did you know that Doctor Who holds the Guinness Book of Records for the largest ongoing fictional book series in history? For fans of the printed page, this had become an important, critical part of the franchise, and then with a wave of his magic wand, all of that work was rendered moot. But Russel T Davies' innovation was to suggest that the audience did not care. They cared about the emotional resonance. They cared that the Doctor was intense and sad about the loss of his people. That it gave him a hook that Rose Tyler could use to build an emotional connection in episode 2, and story beats that they could spot in coming episodes, as the Nestine, Gelf, and many other monsters were described as fugitives from the war. The Time War jettisoned years of continuity that the show had developed without ever being disrespectful to it. It showed that Russell was keen to move forwards, whilst paying lip service to the past and using it wherever needed, but he had not forgotten it. For one brief moment, almost everyone, with the exception of the gay agenda protesters, seemed to be happy. And then Christopher Eccleston very publicly quit. The elation that the show was back, that it was okay, no, it was better than okay, it was good, was suddenly turned on its head. Rumours circled, rather nasty, and it later appeared untruthful comments about Christopher Eccleston were written, and everyone wondered what was going to happen. To his credit, the actor very rarely appeared publicly bitter. He released one very angry statement against the BBC to contradict a statement they had released that he claimed misrepresented him, and then he appeared keen to move on. He even briefly appeared on kids' television show Blue Peter in character. Meanwhile, on the show, a slightly farcical double episode made some of the nervous fan base begin to worry. It had started so well. Episode 1 introduced a companion, Episode 2 is set in the future, Episode 3 in the past. But then Russell wrote a two-parter set in 2005 Britain, where farting space aliens stage a hoax involving a spaceship crashing into Big Ben and a pig in a spacesuit. Years later, I can enjoy this story for what it is, give in and embrace the crazy. But for nervous fans concerned about the future of their show, these episodes were petty, juvenile nonsense. But that was Russell's other grand conceit that the fans had forgotten. Doctor Who was a family show, one that had to entertain and engage young children. The books had been getting progressively darker over the last 15 years, aging with their readers, which, in the wilderness years, was a perfectly logical move. But now that the show was back, it had to appeal to a new, younger audience. The farting aliens were a one-off, well, almost a one-off, but they rattled feathers and gave the press more ammunition to throw at the production team. But Russell's masterstroke in the next episode worked wonders. After avoiding the show's history so carefully, he reached out to fan favourite writer Robert Shearman and asked him to loosely adapt a beloved audio drama focusing on an insane single Dalek, and used that story to bring the Doctor's nemesis back to the small screen. In a stroke, the nervous fans were dragged back into the fold. The Daleks are back. They were the foes in the Time War. They have been wiped out too. They are lethal killing machines like we always knew they were, and they can glide upstairs like we always knew they could. Joke Nazi Pepper Potts no longer. The show presented in a single 45-minute killing spree that, for all intents and purposes, felt like a mid-season reboot. Each week, the series told new stories with new characters, but always the Doctor and Rose remained. In the final episodes, they were joined by a new creation, Jack Harkness, a suave, bisexually rampageous, in a very strictly PG sense, time agent from the future dressed as a 1940s army captain. It was building towards a grand finale where little seeds planted throughout each episode, Bad Wolf, culminated in a grand, invisible season-long arc where Rose Tyler was given the Deus Ex Machina power to pulverise an entire army of Daleks, but only at the cost of her own life. But then, on the point of death, the Doctor steps in and sacrifices himself to save her. And this may be one of the most common criticisms with Russel T Davies' writing. He has been accused of writing Deus Ex Machinas. All 4 of his series finales, 5 if you include the movie special Swan Song, end with a technologically advanced magic wand saving the day. How can he get away with repeating the same cheap trick each time? Build up an unstoppable, terrible enemy, and then just poof, you lose, because I had a trick up my sleeve. He gets away with it because the Deus Ex Machina comes at a terrible cost to the protagonist. In Series 1, Rose can defeat the Daleks, but she has to kill the Doctor to do it. In Series 2, this is inverted as the Doctor can defeat the Daleks, but he has to lose Rose to do it. In Series 4, the Doctor can defeat the Daleks, but he has to wipe Donna's memory so she forgets she was ever his friend. In the 2010 New Year finale, the Master sacrifices himself to beat the Time Lords, and the Doctor has to sacrifice himself to save Wolf. The only one less clear-cut is Series 3, where the Doctor can defeat the Master, but he has to spend a year trapped in a cage, put Martha and Jack through a horrific experience, and then rewind time so that year never happened, except for himself, Martha and Jack, who all remember and are traumatised by the suffering. And then the Master kills himself just to spite the Doctor. Victory constantly comes about through sacrifice and selflessness. We all knew at this point that David Tennant was due to take the reins from Christopher Eccleston. It was widely reported on. His performance in Casanova, also written by Russell just before he started work on Doctor Who, was reinterpreted as something of an audition piece for the role, and when the dust cleared, the second season became even more successful than the first. Across 13 episodes, Russell had introduced the Doctor, the TARDIS, the Time War, i.e. implicitly therefore the Time Lords, the Daleks, and then regeneration piece by piece, a template for all the things anyone who cares about Doctor Who needs to know in order to understand it in one series. But he had done this without once addressing the classic series in detail, or ever hinting to the new audience that they had in any way missed out.